Hello, it's Richard Pears from FinextraTV, and really excited to be joined today by Susanne Schmitt. She's Nature and Spatial Finance Lead for WWF and a good friend of ours over the last year at Finextra, SustainableFinance.Live. How are you?
Yeah, I'm very well, thank you. Thanks, Richard. Nice to be here.
Well, thanks for joining us. And it's we're coming up to our next SustainableFinance.Live. We're focusing in on natural capital. And what we wanted to do was to get you on to try and explain a little bit for us about the role of WWF in this. But first of all, Nature and Spatial Finance Lead. Why does WWF have such a role?
Right, yeah, good question. So yeah, I've been in WWF for for a long time, and so I've really come from a biodiversity, geography, ecology, conservation background, and really moved into the finance world. Yeah, through kind of recognizing and having some very inspirational colleagues a few years back, where I just thought, wow, there's a huge lever here that we could pull, a long lever, quite far removed from the ground, however, very powerful lever in terms of redirecting money away from damaging activities towards more positive activities, and the focus really was always in at least in WWF UK very much around mainstream finance, greening mainstream finance, whereas obviously there's a big group of people focusing on financing green, which is of course also very important to fill the financing gap for green investment. So and really I've come through the route of some sectors, the extractive sector, which is extremely can have extremely big impacts on the environment, on biodiversity, and through that work, I got involved in working on finance, and the spatial aspect was really. We worked on kind of getting a bit ahead of the curve on where extractives are impacting, for example, protected areas, World Heritage Sites, key biodiversity areas. And for that, you need to know where they're spatially located. So we got into acquiring mining data, and we had the other geospatial data, and we started building with colleagues from WWF Norway our own tool called WWF Site, where we could overlay several environmental layers such as protected area shapefiles, for example, with where the mining operations are already exist, or future concessions, both for mining and oil and gas, and that yielded really interesting insights, both from a conservation point of view, but then you realize you then had some information around who owns these mines, who owns these concessions. So you can actually say, oh, okay, we could look at, could we influence through, influencing who finances these operations. That was the start, very concrete sort of start. And then you just actually realize what potential there is for application in terms of, more, I would say, I guess more independent assessment, potential assessment of the impact of certain sectors, in location, in specific locations.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I think that's that's needed, isn't it? Is that absolute sort of independent verification. Now, we're talking in this next event about biodiversity and natural capital, and I think the sustainable finance kind of community within banking, investment, etc., they're getting a clear view of their role in climate change. A lot of that driven, obviously, by policy regulation, risk disclosures, and so forth. But although they're starting to understand that, and net zero and targets of this nature, biodiversity, they're kind of going, wow, what's this? I don't even know what it is necessarily. I think I do. But why should they care about this? Why biodiversity? Why natural capital? Why now?
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think biodiversity is a real technocratic term that was coined in the in the 1990s with the Rio Convention in '92, and just think of it as nature, all-encompassing nature, and biodiversity means the diversity, effectively the diversity of life, from genes right to species, ecosystem, and habitats, and really you see this more and more expressed now. We need to see nature and climate as two sides of the same coin. They're inextricably linked. I mean, climate change impacts nature, already causes species to have to migrate, or and as well as if you destroy a peat swamp forest, it releases massive amount of carbon, therefore impacts on climate. So there is, you can't separate the two. And and we really try and now talk about it in that way, and not see it in these silos. It's still quite hard, and natural capital really, you can see as the stock of the stock of renewable and non-renewable resources, so minerals, soils, but also the animals and species, and plants on which we all depend, really.
And Dasgupta review, which came out, obviously cushioned by the UK's HM Treasury, which was looking at the sort of economics of all of this. He's that balance sheet kind of analogy, hasn't he? Which is to say, we're in loss in the way that we actually, as humans, use nature.
Yeah, and absolutely. And also, I think what is interesting is, like, you can get, a hell of a lot of ecosystem services with relatively poor ecosystems in terms of species and diversity, but you can only push this up to a certain limit. And the biodiversity also, the richer it is, and the more intact it is, it also has an element of resilience. Provides an element of resilience.
So the reason the financial services industry should sort of really care, two sides of the same coin. If you're understanding why climate is damaging, basically your portfolio and opening you to risk and prudential risk and exposure, you're saying it's essentially the same for biodiversity. Now, just for definitions, people often talk about, as you did, ecosystem services and natural capital. What's the difference between those things, if I can ask that?
So yeah, I think I touched on it. So natural capital, you can think of it as the stocks and the stocks you have, and the ecosystem services are the services that flow from it, such as pollination services, flood protection services, the water resources that you need. So I think you can think of it like that, if that makes sense.
Right, absolutely. So if I'm actually got a companies that I'm investing in, and the whole of their sort of work that they do within the ecosystem, you can start to see specific things such as water, air, and so forth, which actually they're using and also being impacted by what's happening as a result of climate change and biodiversity loss. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just just think of it. We would have no food if we didn't have the soil to grow it in, or and currently we are degrading soils at an unprecedented rate, and we take it for granted, but it's it isn't so, and it requires more and more inputs rather than working with nature and restoring soils and maintaining soils in a good health, for example.
That's interesting. So you also mentioned with the a paper from the Dutch Central Bank, I think. What was that about?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was published last year, April, I believe. It was the report was called Indebted to Nature, and the Dutch Central Bank basically looked at assessing, how are they exposed to biodiversity risk, and I believe it's one of the first studies that was done, and it's really interesting, and and particularly kind of thinking back to the 30 by 30 target that I was talking about, it's they already looked at what would be our transition risk, when these targets most likely come into force is the wrong word, but if they get agreed in Kunming in China in October, hopefully, then how much of our investment would be exposed. In terms of, you could even think of it as stranded assets, because if these are going to be legally protected areas, we're going to be restricted in some form, either not being able to operate some companies not able to operate at all, or operate with certain restrictions, and that obviously exposes the exposes the investment. And yeah, and they actually conducted, what I was earlier talking about, spatial analysis in terms of overlapping, looking at areas that are likely to become protected areas, which, for example, there's a whole number of sites recognized globally called key biodiversity areas. And some of them are already protected areas or are likely to be declared protected areas if and when countries are trying to implement the global biodiversity framework targets. And what they found is that I think at the moment, just looking at the figures, at the moment with the existing protected area network, they have already got an exposure of about 15 billion euros, they reckon. And if the targets come to bear, then they have an exposure of 28 billion euros their investment portfolio. And I think that was really interesting for the first time to see that being done. And again, they say it was actually a very conservative estimate because they only had so-called asset level data, geolocation ownership data for multinational companies, and they're often only their headquarters, let alone, but probably not all their supply chain operations. So you can imagine that is a very conservative estimate.
So when you go back to the question of how a financial institution is supposed to measure that, the biodiversity impact of their securities in their portfolio, you use this sort of geospatial data with I think of the asset report that you shared with us at our last SustainableFinance.Live, link it to the ownership of the organizations and then the supply chains. And then you need to start to actually have, a view of where this activity is impacting into these reserved areas. Is that the sort of chain of things? And that seems very complex.
Yeah, I mean, it is complex in one way and it isn't in another, but the where it starts is knowing where everything comes from somewhere. So every product you consume, every product you have in your house will have been produced somewhere, and the resources that make that product will have come from somewhere. So it is it's this key base point that we need the location, and then attached to it the ownership to be able to. And it's almost like I think of it as laddering it up. If you do project finance, it's pretty straightforward. You usually know your location, and you can really in detail look at what impacts and dependencies that project might have on the ground. But if you go to the portfolio level, you might have 500 companies or 1,000 companies in your portfolio, ranging from extractives to tech companies to food companies. Then it is really challenging. But if you do, the more, and for some sectors it's easier. So the extractives, you can get asset level data. Power sector, you can get asset level data. When you talk of the agri supply chain, then it gets really, really tricky. And we can only sometimes, if we're lucky, get down to municipality level. But we can then look at proxies of how is, for example, that municipality, how much deforestation have we recorded, through remote sensing over time, and what are the trends. So, but aggregating all that up to the portfolio level is challenging. But asset level data, I guess, is the start. And what we talked about in the last workshop and in the spatial finance paper that my colleague David Patterson led on, and that we published with the World Bank, really talking about how can we fill that gap of of getting asset level data. And for some areas it will, the transparency and the disclosure probably will never be there unless the companies are disclosing it can feel kind of secure that it is how do you say safe. So we were talking about in the paper about potentially exploring the idea of data exchanges, where it is where it is just secure between, let's say, between the lender and the companies. So there is various aspects that need exploring, but we can already do a lot in the sectors that have that data, and we need to push for more. And in some of, for example, in some of the disclosure standards, TCFD and now the TNFD that are coming, I mean, why not make the disclosure of your asset location and your clear ownership tree, make that a requirement, make and from there we can start working from the bottom up.
Yeah, and this can be done in a secure and permissioned way, the sharing of data. It doesn't have to be absolutely open to everybody. So there's ways of nuancing it. I often think we should look at the sort of open banking and open finance world.
That's right.
Because they put a lot of those constructs in place for a different purpose, but it's still a lot of the same essential technology building blocks. So the role of SustainableFinance.Live and the workshop, and you know, you're very much involved in this next one. You're going to share a lot of this kind of information with us, and then we're going to workshop. How do you think, you know, that something like that can help to educate and help us to, you know, discuss and collaborate on these challenges?
Yeah, I think it's a great forum, just because we have, you know, real practitioners, you know, both in finance, in tech, but also, you know, in conservation, and also some people who straddle those different aspects, which I think are the really great connectors, you know, in terms of making those 2 or 3 worlds speak to each other. And I think for that, you know, I think the Sustainable Finance Live workshops and events are really great, bringing people together and building, first of all, the networks between the people presenting, but then also obviously reaching out and bring that information and build awareness. And you know, and what I've been talking about was very much about focusing on how do we green mainstream finance, you know, through better data, better disclosure, you know, I'd hopefully also more regulation in that space, which would, you know, actually then help with the urgency of it. But also, I think in this work, you know, in this workshop, we're also looking at the other aspects of how do we finance green by making nature and nature recovery investable. And for example, the tokenization workshop, I think in particular, will speak to that. And I really look forward to taking part in that workshop. So.
Yeah, I'm really excited about that as well. Well, thanks so much today, Susanne, for taking us through that and putting some context on it for us. And I'm really looking forward to working with you on the workshop as well.
Yeah,
So
likewise.
for now, thanks so much. See you soon.
Great. Yeah, thanks a lot.